The Aging in Motion Coalition is made up of more than 30 nonprofit, patient, and research advocacy organizations working together to increase recognition of sarcopenia. AIM was founded in 2011, and our core goal is to promote clear clinical development and regulatory pathways for treatments that can improve the lives of people with sarcopenia. We've had positive and ongoing interactions with the Food and Drug Administration on this condition, and we're fortunate that FDA will convene a patient-focused drug development meeting on sarcopenia by the end of fiscal year 2017. This meeting will increase FDA's understanding of sarcopenic patients' experiences and their hopes for potential treatments. Both the FDA and EMA have stressed the importance of including PROs in clinical trials for sarcopenia, but currently there are no PRO measures that have specifically been accepted for this condition. AIM held their first discussion on PROs in March of 2014 to begin exploring what the optimal PRO for sarcopenia would look like. If you're interested, a summary of that meeting can be found on our website, www.aginginmotion.org. We believe that functional measures and self-report measures can work in concert to affect optimal health outcomes for patients. There are some stellar experts here for you this morning who will provide their thoughts on this very subject. I'll introduce each person before he speaks, and we're asking that all questions be reserved for the Q&A period at the end of the program. But as you think of questions, you can feel free to use the WebEx chat function, Q&A, or send an email to me at cbenz@agingresearch.org, and I'll be sure to add them to the discussion queue. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize AIM sponsors, GE Healthcare, Hologic, GlaxoSmithKline, Eli Lilly and Company, Sanofi, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, and Nutricia. Without your support, programs like the one today would not be possible, so thank you so much for your commitment. We're fortunate this morning to have as our first speaker Dr. Wen-Hung Chen, who is joining us from the FDA. Dr. Chen will be giving prepared remarks but will not be able to respond to questions. He is currently reviewer on the Clinical Outcomes Assessment staff in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Office of New Drugs. Dr. Chen's responsibilities include supporting the review divisions on issues related to the development and interpretation of study endpoints and supporting the Drug Development Tool Qualification Program. He was involved with the development of the Pain Item Bank for the NIH-led Patient-Reported Outcome Measurement Information System, or PROMIS, as many of us know it. He was also involved in the development of the Exacerbations of Chronic Pulmonary Disease tool developed under the ExactPro initiative. Dr. Chen earned his master's degree and doctorate in quantitative psychology with a minor in biostatistics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His publications have appeared in the Journal of Educational and Behavioral Statistics, the British Journal of Mathematical and Statistical Psychology, the Journal of Educational Measurement, the Journal of Pain Symptom and Management, Pain Quality of Life Research, Clinical Drug Investigation, European Respiratory Journal, CHEST, and Health Outcomes Research in Medicine. Dr. Chen will provide an overview of the role FDA might see PROs playing in clinical trials for sarcopenia. So Dr. Chen, please take it away.
Thank you, Cynthia, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Next slide, please. So the first is the disclaimer that the view expressed in this presentation are those of mine and do not necessarily represent those official FDA positions. Next slide, please. So as Cynthia mentioned, this presentation is a general overview on patient-reported outcome assessment from the regulatory perspective. Using sarcopenia as an example, I will focus on patient-reported outcome assessment in a broader context of patient-focused drug development. Many types of outcome assessment can be used in the patient-focused drug development programs, and oftentimes they can be used to support each other. The important thing is whether this assessment can inform us on how patients feel or function. CEDAR has focused on advancing understanding of what matters to patients in terms of how they feel or function through our patient engagement activities, like the meeting that Cynthia just mentioned. We are also working on advanced measurement science and successfully major patient-centered outcome in clinical trial. Patient input to development of such a tool is essential. So these activities all rely heavily on patient input to ensure that we measure the right thing in the right way to inform patients and clinician decisions. Next slide, please. So now I will like to discuss some of the things that we think when incorporating patient-centered outcomes in clinical trial at each stage of drug development from the translation stage and forward. At the translation stage, which may take place outside a specific drug development program, we seek to understand the burden of disease, including symptoms, signs, and impact on daily life function and on how patients feel. For example, for sarcopenia, we need to think about what are its symptoms and impact, such as loss of physical function, disability, impact on activity of daily living, etc. From here, we can begin to consider how to go about to measure those concepts. Then we can think about, is there an existing scale that is appropriate for this context? If not, is there one that could be modified? Or does a new scale need to be developed from scratch? And next, in the interview, IND review stage, the earlier the better. We seek to further understand what endpoint matter to most to the patient and what are the anticipated benefit of the drug. And this is, of course, related to the translational stage. What are the signs and symptoms and impact that we want to measure? And the endpoint will be actually the endpoint will be the direct measurement of that we identify in the translational stage. We review the endpoint to ensure they are patient-centered and well-defined and reliable. We also review them for feasibilities. We look at responder burdens also. At the NDA BLA stage, we seek to confirm that the changes are not only statistically significant, but are clinically meaningful at the individual patient level. We also seek to ensure that the information is portrayed in the labeling in a way that is both accurate and non-misleading. And so this is actually a continuing process, and we encourage early communication and continuous communication to the agency is essential and important for the successful development of the patient-focused drug development and also patient-centered outcome measures. Next slide, please. To understand how patient input can inform a clinical outcome assessment, so let us first step back to remind ourselves of the goal of these outcome measures. Outcome measures aim to demonstrate treatment benefit, which is demonstrated by evidence that the treatment has a positive impact of an outcome interest. Most notable is how long a patient lives or how a patient feels or functions in daily life. So for sarcopenia, we need to clearly understand what are the important treatment benefits from patient's perspective. Treatment benefit can come in the form of comparative advantage of the drug in how the patient feels, function, or survive as a result of treatment or disease conditions, or you can be shown as a comparison of treatment-related toxicology. The toxicology may be more relevant in terms of, say, in oncology, but still we need to consider it for sarcopenia as also because we want to make sure that the treatment doesn't create a toxical side effect. The next slide, please. So evidence of treatment benefit can be direct or indirect. Direct evidence is the treatment benefit that's derived from study that measure survival or how the patient feels and functions. And indirect evidence is better derived from study with that does not direct measure how patients survive, feel, or function. Next slide, please. It is often helpful to think in terms of a continuum of direct and indirect evidence of treatment benefit. Depending on how indirect something is, the more evidence we may need to think what we have measured to actual impact on patients' daily lives. For example, a performance measure like the 6 minutes walk test are somewhat indirect because they are not measuring how people feel or function in daily life, but are used as an approximation of how patients feel or function in daily life. With this type of performance measurement, it is critical to understand what the performance test is actually measuring, what the score represents, and how that all translate in terms of meaningful benefit to the patients in daily life. Biomarkers such as blood pressure or muscle mass index are surrogates for treatment benefits and are at the far end of the indirect side of the continuum. Therefore, we need very strong evidence showing that the biomarker predict clinical benefit and how patients feel, function, or survive. Next slide, please. And we need to think about evaluating treatment benefit. We recommend that the core disease-defined concept to be assessed first and considered before we think about more downstream effects. So, for example, think about assessing physical function or physical performance in patients with sarcopenia. We might think about how sarcopenia impair physical function and impact daily activity of daily life, daily living, such as ability to self-care, which may be an important daily activity to patients. A more distal function may be the work productivities. And the work productivity is distal is not primary because there are many other things that affect productivity, such as the type of work they do, how far they have to work, have trouble to work, what kind of social support they have in their working environments. So these are not as direct as the daily living in terms of self-care. So we also need to think about what is the core concept that we want to measure. Next slide, please. So what is sarcopenia? Sarcopenia is generally described as a condition with loss of muscle mass and function observed with aging, which in turn may affect balance, gait, and may lead to disability and loss of functional independence. To define the target patient population for the purpose of drug development and to eventually select individuals who are most likely to be benefited from the drug therapy and treating sarcopenia, objective diagnostic criteria are needed. Having said that, so anyone who is interested in seeking a labeling claim for treatment of sarcopenia should discuss with the review divisions regarding the definition and diagnosis of sarcopenia, whether it is sarcopenia associated with aging or with other comorbidities. We should discuss the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the target patient populations, and what are the treatment benefits. Next slide, please. So we back to the more general patient-centered assessment. So how to measure how patients feel and functions. The clinical assessment is influenced by human choice, judgment, motivation, and may support either direct or indirect evidence of treatment benefits. There are types of COAs, patient-reported outcomes. We are familiar with the term PRO. It's also there are also clinical reported outcomes, observed reported outcome, and performance reported outcomes. All these may be related or useful to assessing sarcopenia. Next slide, please. The thing about COAs, when we think about which type of COA that we want to use, how we use to measure it, we need to think about the endpoint model. the choice of instrument, the content validity, and other measurement properties. Clinical trial design element, data analysis. All this has to be taken into consideration of selecting or developing COA. What aspect of daily life is the COA measure intended to represent it, like self-care in sarcopenia? So is this a direct or indirect measure of the treatment benefit? Again, think about what is most important in terms of the sarcopenia patient in terms of their function and daily living. Next slide, please. So when is the clinical outcome assessment adequate for use? For the regulatory purpose, the COA should be well-defined and reliable. So what does that mean? It means that measuring the right thing in the right way of defining the populations, the target context of use, the right target populations, and the score that quantify the thing, the concept, that's so accurately and reliably, so that the effect seen in the outcome assessment can be interpreted as a clear treatment benefit. So the assessment, the outcome has to be interpretable and clinically meaningful. Next slide, please. And the outcome assessment that we usually use the term that should be fit for purpose. So by fit for purpose, we mean that the tool is sufficiently well defined and reliable. And the PRO guidance, the FDA PRO guidance, provide the ultimate approach to the PRO development and interpretations. And it can be used for as the guidelines for consider other COA as well, like the clinician outcome assessment or performance outcome assessment. And we also recognize that flexibility and judgment needed to meet the practical demands. A guideline is an ultimate approach, but there will be some flexibility and judgment as well. And in terms of fit for purpose, we also need to consider we will consider the tool's measurement properties such as content validity, the construct validity, reliability, ability to detect change. And we also consider information to support the interpretation of the score change. Next slide, please. So thinking about meaningful change, as I mentioned earlier, the content validity, I think, is the foremost one that we assess whether the COA is fit for purpose. But the ultimate goal is actually how the change is meaningful. So that is actually one of the biggest challenges of interpreting result of the PRO or other COA is how do we know how much change in a measurement that is meaningful. This is especially challenging for assessing treatment benefit for sarcopenia as well. For example, how much of the increase in body mass is actually clinically meaningful in terms of improving how patients feel or functions, or how much increase in, say, gait speed or 60-minute walk distance, is that meaningful to the patients, or how much the change is meaningful to the patients? These are all challenging in terms of measuring sarcopenia treatment benefit. And so we need to think carefully, and we encourage development and discussions with us, the PRO assessment or other CO assessment for sarcopenia, and we'd like to see that the measurement is able to measure the meaningful change in the patients in terms of treatment benefit, and to improve the patient's daily function and daily living as well. Next slide, please. So here are the helpful link to what I just mentioned, the PRO guidance and other helpful information about development of clinical assessment outcomes, COAs, and PROs. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chen. We really appreciate you running through that that presentation for us. It's very helpful. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ronen Rubinoff. Dr. Rubinoff is Global Translational Medicine Head of Musculoskeletal Diseases and Global Translational Medicine Head of Cell Therapies for Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research. Dr. Rubinoff is also a member of AIM Science Advisory Board. He received his MD from Northwestern University in 1983 and trained in internal medicine and rheumatology at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, where he was chief resident in medicine. In 1990, he completed concurrent fellowships in rheumatology and in clinical epidemiology at Johns Hopkins, receiving a master's of health science degree. He then trained in nutrition at Tufts University. Dr. Rubinoff was Chief of Nutrition, Exercise, Physiology, and Sarcopenia Laboratory from 1997 to 2002, and the Director of Human Studies from 2001 to 2002, both at the Jean Mayer USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts. He's currently Adjunct Professor of Nutrition and Associate Professor of Medicine at Tufts and Tufts Medical Center. From 2002 to 2006, Dr. Rubinoff was Senior Director of Molecular Medicine at Millennium Pharmaceuticals, where he directed research on biomarkers and personalized medicine. From 2007 to 2009, he was Senior Director of Immunology Research and Development at Biogen IDEC, where he led translational medicine and early development efforts for the immunology group. In September of 2009, he was appointed Global Translational Medicine Head for Musculoskeletal Diseases at Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dr. Rubinoff is going to give us an industry perspective on the importance of PROs in clinical trials. So Dr. Rubinoff, please, take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I really appreciate the presentation by Dr. Chen because it really sets the stage. And we'll just make a few comments off of that without slides. First of all, I would really like to recommend to everyone that you read the PRO guidance from FDA. It's really our Bible for how to do this, and we've done it now a number of times for various indications. And I find it's one of the really easiest guidances to follow. So I highly recommend it. Second of all, our experience with PROs for muscle weakness and muscle atrophy really began with our current lead candidate drug, which is called bimagrumab. And our lead indication there is actually not sarcopenia, we're working on that, but a more uncommon rare condition called inclusion body myositis. And there are a couple of lessons that we got from that experience where we actually developed a PRO using this guidance and had it go through the process for validation. The first point was that there had already been what was thought to be a reasonable PRO for this disease developed by academic researchers. But when we used it in a clinical setting with a treatment, we found that it really wasn't very sensitive to change. And it had not gone through the formal assessment of whether it really connected to patients' own perceptions of what they found to be most troubling about their disease. So based on that, we actually went ahead and did a completely new PRO. And although some of the items turned out to be the same, that was actually only true for about half the items, and the other half were ranked, were quite different. In addition, the ranking system we used was a 10-point scale instead of a 4-point scale as originally done. And that gave us, I think, better responsiveness with the patient-reported outcomes. So we're now in the midst of a phase 2b/3 study in inclusion body myositis, and we'll find out whether this method actually is going to be successful. Of course, it also helps if the drug is successful, so we'll see. But because of that, we also went ahead with sarcopenia and have started developing a PRO as well. And that is still in progress, but we certainly hope that once it's completed, that we'll be able to share it with the community, because I think in general, these kinds of tools are best utilized and understood when they're used by many different researchers in different contexts. So we don't really see this as a proprietary issue. The other thing I'd like to point out is that for us, as Dr. Chen mentioned in his slide 8, the one with the sort of the cylinder with the slices for the various disease-defining concepts on the left moving through proximal and distal impacts. It's really important that we get our primary outcome right, and the primary outcome should really be something that's a core symptom or sign for the disease. And if we're considering sarcopenia, then I think it's very clear that what we're worried about is reduced physical functioning. And so whatever you choose as your primary outcome really, I think, needs to relate to that. And while patient-reported outcomes are, sort of becoming more generally recognized and accepted, patient performance outcomes are, much newer and less well understood segment of outcomes research and endpoints. So, we've used 6-minute walk, for example. The Aging in Motion Consortium has been interested in the short physical performance battery as something that might undergo a COA. And, I think whatever sponsors tend to, wind up using, the key thing is that it will measure function directly in some observed fashion. Then the PRO comes in to fit the second part of the FDA definition of what a drug should do, which is make people feel better or function better. So the feel better part really has to be self-reported, and that's where the patient-reported outcome comes in. And to us, it's really crucial that we get that right as well. Like any other sponsor, we vastly prefer to have that as a key secondary rather than as a co-primary endpoint, because it's simply harder to get both parts of a co-primary to hit right. I mean, you really need to have lightning strike twice. So that's something that's an ongoing negotiation. It will be, I think, for any project or any drug submission. But these two things together, I think, are the pillars upon which we will, I hope, succeed in getting drugs approved for sarcopenia as adjuncts to all of the various dietary and exercise and lifestyle interventions that are going to be part of that, I think, future treatment pyramid. So those really are the points that I wanted to make. If I can answer any questions later, I'm more than happy to do so. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Renan. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steven Joel Kunze. Dr. Kunze is Executive Director of the Patient-Reported Outcomes Consortium at the Critical Path Institute, or CPATH. Prior to joining CPATH, he was professor in the College of Pharmacy at the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health at the University of Arizona. For over 2 decades, the primary focus of his research has been on measurement of patient-reported outcomes, including health-related quality of life. After receiving his BS in pharmacy from the University of Connecticut, Dr. Kunze completed a hospital pharmacy residency at the VA Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona. He also earned an MS in pharmacy and an MED in higher education and a PhD in pharmacy, administrative and behavioral sciences from the University of Arizona. His postdoctoral training in health outcomes research was completed at the University of California, San Diego. Previous academic appointments have been in colleges of pharmacy, medicine, and allied health professions at the University of Kentucky and in the Division of Healthcare Sciences at the UCSD School of Medicine. Dr. Kunze is an emeritus professor at the University of Arizona and a fellow in the American Association of Pharmaceutical Sciences. AIM's 2014 meeting on PROs highlighted that a consortium of public-private sponsors to analyze findings from exploratory uses of PROs in clinical trials could accelerate efforts towards developing a PRO measure for sarcopenia. The PR consortium under Dr. Kunze's leadership has really drawn the roadmap on how to work across sectors successfully. The PRO consortium doesn't have a project in sarcopenia, but Dr. Kunze will share some best practices from the CPATH experience, so we might learn from them. So Dr. Kunze, let me pull up your slides, and please take it away.
Thank you, Cynthia. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very worthwhile discussion. As you suggest, I really am an advocate for multi-stakeholder collaboration for PRO instrument development and qualification. And this type of collaboration is especially important in the context of clinical trials and sarcopenia. So although, as you indicated, we're not doing anything within the PRO consortium regarding this, but I think there are some lessons learned within the PRO consortium that I would like to just talk about today. So next slide, please. And part of the impetus for the consortium approach, which is the approach we're taking, is this statement by the FDA. Because of the substantial work needed to achieve qualification, CDER encourages the formation of collaborative groups to undertake these tool development programs to increase the efficiency of joint efforts and to lessen the resource burden upon any individual person or company working to gain qualification for a tool. It's incredibly important, and that's the basis for why anyone would join a consortium to move forward with the qualification of any COA tool that would be used as an endpoint in a clinical trial. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little background in terms of the PRO consortium, we're part of the Critical Path Institute, and the Critical Path Institute was established in 2005 by the University of Arizona and CDER as a public-private partnership, and we're funded in part by a grant from the FDA. And CPATH is dedicated to implementing FDA's Critical Path Initiative, and we do that by providing a neutral pre-competitive venue for collaboration aimed at accelerating development of safe and effective medical products. And that really was the gist of the FDA's Critical Path Initiative, to accelerate and to facilitate, develop tools that move safe and effective medical products through this critical path to ultimately enhancing the health of humans. Next slide, please. So the PRO consortium was formed by CPATH in 2008 in cooperation with CDER in the pharmaceutical industry. So our members are pharmaceutical firms. So this year we have 26 members, and other participating stakeholders include folks from the NIH, but this FDA is very important, and I think Dr. Chen's participation in this webinar today demonstrates FDA's commitment to patient-focused drug development and their willingness to be partners in the development of more optimal clinical trial endpoints. And so I'm so glad that Dr. Chen was able to join us today. So the FDA has a tremendous role and is a participating stakeholder in what we do, and I know they have been as well in the sarcopenia area. And then we also have clinical consultants, academic researchers, patients, and then we partner with research organizations that help us develop our instruments. Next slide, please. So the goals of the PRO consortium, and these are broad, they extend well beyond the PRO consortium, because for any consortium in this area, it's to develop qualified, publicly available PRO instruments for use in assessing primary or secondary clinical trial endpoints. And this public availability portion of this is incredibly important. The FDA is investing their time and effort in this with the expectation that these tools that are developed will be readily available by other researchers, other pharma firms. Dr. Rubinoff spoke about this as well, that they expect that their instrument that they're developing, they actually not only expect it, they want it to be used by other firms, so we can really determine the measurement properties and to determine whether the tool actually does what we need it to do in the context of a clinical trial. Another goal is to enable pre-competitive collaboration that includes the FDA input and expertise, avoid development of multiple PRO instruments for the same purpose. This happens all the time. There may be 5 pharma firms that are developing an instrument for asthma clinical trials, when indeed, what a waste of time and effort that is, and we can avoid that through a consortium approach. Also, the costs are rather large in terms of developing new PRO instruments, and it's nice to be able to share the costs of developing these tools through a consortium approach. And then a real goal that people don't always think about is we really want to facilitate FDA's review of medical products by standardizing PRO endpoints. If there are more standardized PRO endpoints, The FDA doesn't have to investigate the measurement properties and the development of these tools, these multiple tools, and can focus on one standardized PRO endpoint. And if it's qualified, then they can point to this instrument and say, this is the one we would like you to use. You don't have to use it, but we would like you to use it. And it actually could expedite the review process for that new medical product. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of the PRO consortium working groups, we have six that are listed here that are working on PRO measures. And you can see the number of firms we have engaged in those working groups, and then we have one, the cognition working group, that's working toward qualification of a performance outcome measure of instrumental activities of daily living, and that's for mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. So this is our path to FDA qualification, but it would be similar in any qualification effort in a consortium or even as an individual company. Letter of intent, initial briefing document, and then the content validity stage, and Dr. Chen talked about the importance of the content validity of an instrument. And this is a mixture of both qualitative research, in terms of we need to do very focused patient research to determine that we are actually measuring what we should be measuring in terms of the patient's perceptions of what is important to them in that disease, and then quantitative research. Once we have items that we've developed based on concept elicitation, we do a series of quantitative studies, and also we do qualitative research around those items to make sure that people are interpreting them and responding to them in the way we intended. And then the rest of these bullets, the last three bullets, I have in blue because we haven't even gotten there yet. We're going to be submitting briefing documents in the first quarter of 2016 for at least 3 of our working groups, so that we will be at that point in time seeking qualification for use of the measures that are emerging from those working groups in exploratory studies, that first level of qualification. But this just gives you a sense of the fact that we've still got a good deal more work to do before we get to the ultimate point or outcome that we're seeking, which is full qualification of our measures for use as primary or secondary endpoints in clinical trials. Next slide, please. So I put this up here sort of in jest, but the consortium approach to PRO instrument qualification, one of the advantages is it brings together multiple stakeholders to work collaboratively toward a common goal. That's also a disadvantage, and so I'll talk to you a little about the challenges on the next slide. So one of the issues is that the time it takes to gain consensus and make decisions within working groups that are made up of potentially 10 or 12 different firms that outside of the working group are competitors in that specific therapeutic area. And inside the working group, this is a pre-competitive environment, and so our attempt is to provide that venue so we actually can collaborate successfully. But there are times when it's not easy to gain consensus and make decisions within those working groups, although we ultimately get there. Executing project agreements with member firms, that relates to the fact that we have to deal with a lot of industry attorneys, and that can be very challenging at times in terms of getting project agreements through those firms and ultimately fully executed. Having the right people involved and engaged is incredibly important and also a challenge. Instrument development and qualification within a consortium can take longer than it would take for an individual company to do it because of all the challenges above this specific bullet point. And then maintaining sponsor interest over the many years of the qualification process can be a challenge. Next slide, please. But I think what we found is the benefits really do outweigh those challenges. And the ability to leverage financial resources from multiple stakeholders is really important. Leveraging human resources and expertise from those multiple stakeholders also incredibly important. The other thing is we are able to collectively address scientific, technical, and practical issues with the FDA to gain consensus or agreement. And it's easier for us to go to the FDA with an idea from multiple stakeholders than it is for any individual or individual firm to address those issues with the FDA. So there is strength in that, and it's a benefit of our consortium approach. And then collectively advancing the science of PRO and other COA measurement is a real benefit here. And this facilitates a partnership with the FDA to optimize the qualification process. It's a part of what we've been able to do is we've been able to help the FDA as they help us to evolve the process in a way that makes the most sense and gets us to our mutual goal. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. I know we're running short on time, but just to say a few things, and you need to ensure in a consortium approach that all necessary expertise and perspectives are at the table. Ensure that there's a shared understanding of the qualification process among all stakeholders, and that's critical. You know, the companies or the stakeholders involved have to know what we're really working toward in regard to this qualification. And then establish clear leadership and facilitation roles for all meetings and activities. We need to seek participants for whom this activity is a part of their job rather than in addition to a full-time job to get really their engagement. And the bottom line, or the last bullet, is build a cushion in the project timelines to account for unanticipated delays due to a number of things, and I won't go into those now. Next slide, please. Testimonials, that's a rather dramatic word. It really, these are responses in regard to a question that I asked about what value do you receive in this consortium approach that we're taking. And so I'll just go through these. These aren't quotes per se, they're paraphrased, so I don't have quotes around them. But discussions with FDA representatives provide valuable insight into current agency thinking in the context of the PRO instrument development process. Open discussions with the FDA representatives and industry colleagues in a collaborative pre-competitive forum are extremely valuable, and it's valuable to work with like-minded researchers supporting the patient perspective in the context of patient-focused drug development. Next slide, please. And just a few more. Insights based on the discussions add tremendous value to internal member firm discussions, meaning there are takeaways from the interaction that we're able to have within the consortium approach that help individuals within our individual member firms to advance their goals within their firm, and the ability to leverage resources from industry, regulatory agencies, and academia to bring the appropriate individuals together in order to deal with key scientific issues. And then the last one helps to de-risk the process of PRO instrument development. Members can leverage the expertise of others and share the cost of development. So next slide, please. So this is my final slide. So from my perspective, a multi-stakeholder collaborative approach enables the sharing of ideas, human resources, and costs. There are significant benefits and challenges which are non-insurmountable to the consortium approach. But members of the PRO consortium have remained committed to this consortium approach, and that's been gratifying. The qualification process continues to be refined as FDA and other stakeholders gain experience with it, which has been extremely important. And then patience is a virtue, because this is not necessarily a quick process, but it's an important one and well worth the investment of time and effort. So I know that was quick, but again, I want to thank Cynthia for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. And advancing the science of PRO-based endpoints for sarcopenia trials is an incredibly important endeavor. And from my perspective, it is optimal to do it collaboratively. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Steven. I think you did a great job of showing that there are multi-layers of benefits to everyone working together, and in particular for a disease like sarcopenia, where there's a real urgent need for consensus around endpoints, and for companies to work together who are interested in running more advanced clinical trials, that this is going to be something we need to look at the future. So now I'm going to open the floor to Q&A. If you haven't already, please send a question via the chat function or send an email to cbenz@agingresearch.org. And right now, both Steven Kunze and Ronan Rubinoff's lines are open. And again, I'd just like to reiterate that Dr. Chen is not able to take questions at this time. And it looks like we do have a question that's coming from a participant who's actually in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is working in exercise that's emerged in an area where exercise has emerged as an important therapeutic tool. And I think, Dr. Rubinoff, you might be well positioned to speak about this. Our participant would like to know if you have an opinion about the use of exercise to combat sarcopenia.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we obviously exercise can increase muscle mass and strength and function in people in their 90s and even over 100. There are two issues. One is that the process of sarcopenia should be distinctly thought of differently from the outcomes of sarcopenia. So the process is universal. It's part of normal aging, and it happens to everyone. People who are more physically active retain more ability to function, but they still lose muscle mass and strength. And in fact, if you look at master athletes' records, they decline with age, even though these people are intensely training well into their 70s and 80s. The issue, I think, is that exercise is going to be part of the approach to sarcopenia, along with diet and perhaps in some people drugs. The outcome of sarcopenia is mobility and disability, and it's those people who we really think should be the ones where perhaps a pharmacological intervention would be considered, either because they're already so weak that exercise is very difficult for them, or they have other comorbid conditions, or you can use a drug to help exercise work better and the exercise to help a drug work better, and you get people to a better functional level faster. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Rubinoff. There is a second question that we have, and I think, Steven, you might be able to address this. In your experience working to develop PROs for other diseases and conditions, are there examples where the concepts that were captured by a PRO instrument closely align with any of the concepts that were included in a performance-based measure?
Well, that certainly is a possibility, and there are conditions in which you may need to select one over another, like the area of instrumental activities of daily living. We can ask people to complete a questionnaire about their functioning in regard to instrumental activities of daily living, but we can also have performance-based tests where they do activities that are reflective of what are considered the important instrumental activities of daily living to allow people to remain independent. And so the decision just has to be made which one of those sources of information is the most reliable and valid. And in some cases, like in mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease, the performance-based approach may be better than the patient-reported outcome approach because of the fact that the patients may have lost insight and may not fully understand the decrements that are occurring in their daily functioning. So it very much depends on a decision that you need to make regarding which is the best source of that information when you have potentially two COA approaches to capturing that information.
Great. Well, that seems to be all the time we have. Sorry that we were running late and we had to cut the question and answer period short. But if you do have a question that we have not been able to answer, you can feel free to send me an email at cbenz@agingresearch.org, and we can follow up with the speakers to see if we can get an answer to your questions. Just wanted to let you all know that the recording from the webinar and any speaker presentations are going to be available at aginginmotion.org in the next few days. And I'd just like to thank Sarah DeJovene and Ryan Carney on the Alliance for Aging Research staff for making the WebEx possible today. And again, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the Aging in Motion Coalition, GE Healthcare, Hologic, Eli Lilly and Company, GlaxoSmithKline, Sanofi, Regeneron, and Nutricia for their generous support of the coalition. Hopefully, as we move forward, we'll be able to have additional programs like this in the future. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and we hope you have a great day.